Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 391 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about the JFK assassination, Howard Hunt, and Marita Lorenz. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
In 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Who did it has been controversial ever since. In the years that followed, some accused CIA agent E. Howard Hunt, and Hunt retaliated by suing some of those who made the accusation. And in 1985, Hunt appeared in a courtroom in the state of Florida to tell his version of events and prove that his critics had libeled him. But his critics had a chance to respond. So what did Hunt say? What did his critics say? And what was revealed about the possible role of the CIA in the JFK assassination? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. So Jimmy, what should we know about today's episode?
Well, today is the first part of a two-part episode where we're going to be looking at a particular theory of the JFK assassination. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, or 62 years ago this month. We first discussed the Kennedy assassination way back in episode 15 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, in which I gave a basic overview of the subject. My basic conclusion was that there was significant evidence pointing to Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone killer, and that there was also significant evidence pointing to a conspiracy in which Oswald may have been a gunman, or he may have been exactly what he said he was, which was a patsy. I thus concluded that you're not crazy, no matter which basic theory you endorse. And I said that we'd be looking at further aspects of the case in future episodes. I originally planned to do an annual episode on a different aspect of the case on the anniversary, like we're doing this year, but that didn't work out most years, though we have done a few episodes, like in episode 233 on Oswald's first assassination attempt, or episode 373 on the recent congressional JFK hearings. This time, though, we're going to be doing what I originally planned to do and look at a particular theory of the case.
Okay, then before we do that, let's get an overview of the basic facts of the case that everyone agrees on. What should we know?
On Friday, November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy was making a political visit to Texas and was in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. At 12:30, he was on his way to lunch in a motorcade in Dallas at a place called Dealey Plaza when suddenly shots rang out and the president was fatally hit. Some witnesses thought that some of the shots came from the Texas School Book Depository, which was behind the motorcade, and some witnesses thought that shots came from a grassy knoll that was in front of and alongside the motorcade. At 1:15 p.m., a Dallas police officer named J.D. Tippit was also shot and killed, and at 1:51, the Dallas police had a man in custody named Lee Harvey Oswald, an employee of the School Book Depository. Later that day, Oswald was charged first with the killing of Officer Tippit, and then with the killing of President Kennedy. Oswald denied killing anyone and said that he was just a patsy. 2 days later, on Sunday, November 24th, Oswald was in the basement of the Dallas City Jail in preparation for being transferred to the county jail, when suddenly a bystander fatally shot him. The man who shot Oswald was a local nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. Ruby was arrested, and he later made strange statements about his actions. However, in 1966, he died of a pulmonary embolism or a blood clot in his lungs while he was still in custody. His final legal fate had not yet been determined. Immediately after Kennedy's assassination, new President Lyndon Johnson appointed a commission to investigate it. The commission was headed by then Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren, so it became known as the Warren Commission. In September 1964, 10 months after the assassination, it published a report that held Oswald had killed the president and had acted alone, so no conspiracy, and that Jack Ruby had also killed Oswald alone, so no conspiracy there either. However, many were very skeptical of the report, and in 1976, the U.S. House of Representatives established the House Select Committee on Assassinations. When it delivered its final report in 1979, it contradicted the Warren Commission and concluded that President Kennedy was likely killed as the result of a conspiracy, although it did not identify who was involved, though various members of the committee and its associates had their own theories. So we now had two different government bodies coming, the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations, coming to opposite conclusions about whether there was a conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination.
Okay, if those are the basic facts of the assassination, what's the basic nature of the theory that we're going to be considering today?
Today's theory of the JFK assassination is that the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, was involved. Now, there are several things to note about this theory. First, if the CIA was involved, it doesn't mean that everybody at the CIA was involved, or even that the leadership of the CIA was involved. It could have been a small group of rogue agents doing an unauthorized project. And second, if the CIA was involved, that doesn't mean that only the CIA was involved. The CIA often works with other groups, including front groups, to cover its activities. So other parties like the Mafia and disgruntled Cuban refugees also could be involved.
Let's start with the CIA, though. What motive would the CIA or some of its members have for killing President Kennedy?
We need a little background for this, but between 1953 and 1959, the Cuban Revolution took place. It ended with the revolutionaries winning and Fidel Castro in charge of Cuba. Now, Cuba is just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and the CIA and U.S. business interests had been heavily involved in Cuba all through the 20th century. We discussed some of that in episode 151 on Operation Northwoods. Well, there was an initial hope that Fidel Castro, who had frequently denounced communism in the past, would be friendly to the United States, but the relationship soured, and Castro began seizing U.S. businesses in Cuba and nationalizing them. In response, the CIA started planning ways to overthrow or kill him. Preliminary approval for some of these plans was given by U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, but they didn't come to fruition by the time he left office at the beginning of 1961. Kennedy thus inherited a plan to invade Cuba using a military force made up of Cuban exiles who were to be backed up by U.S. air support. But the plan was to keep the U.S. involvement secret so that this would look like a purely Cuban initiative. The invasion was planned to take place at a location in Cuba known as the Bay of Pigs. The CIA assured Kennedy that the plan had a good likelihood of success and that there would be a popular uprising against Castro when it started. But when it was launched in April of 1961, it failed disastrously. Kennedy also refused to order additional U.S. air support, and so the Cuban invaders were defeated, many were killed, and many more were captured and tortured in not very nice Cuban prisons. This resulted in many Cuban exiles being very, very mad at Kennedy, and in many CIA officers also being very, very mad at Kennedy. In the aftermath, Kennedy had the head of the CIA, Allen Dulles, fired, and Allen Dulles bizarrely would be appointed as a key member of the Warren Commission to investigate President Kennedy's death by President Johnson. Also, according to the New York Times,
and President Kennedy, as the enormity of the Bay of Pigs disaster came home to him, said to one of the highest officials of his administration that he wanted to splinter the CIA in 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds.
So there was a ton of animosity between Kennedy and the CIA after the Bay of Pigs disaster, with many CIA agents feeling that Kennedy had betrayed them and their Cuban allies by failing to support the invasion. Incidentally, the Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961 helped set up the later Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which we discussed in episodes 213 and 214, and again in episode 228 on the secret Cuban Missile Crisis that the public didn't know about.
Okay, so some in the CIA had a hatred of Kennedy, but a lot of people hated Kennedy, and that doesn't mean the CIA killed him. So what might connect them to the Kennedy assassination?
Immediately after the assassination, several Dallas newspapers photographed three unknown, scruffily dressed men in Dallas police custody near the school book depository. Together, they are known as the Three Tramps. People began speculating that they might have a connection to the assassination, and based on the photographs, It was proposed that the three tramps were CIA agents. One of them was proposed to be a man named E. Howard Hunt, and another was proposed to be a man named Frank Sturgis. Now, recent research suggests that these identifications are in error, and that according to Dallas police records, the three tramps were men named Gus Abrams, Harold Doyle, and John Gedney. However, this was part of what got people thinking about whether CIA agents like Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis may have had involvement with the JFK assassination.
The names E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis may be familiar to some of our listeners because they're connected with another major event in 20th century American history. What was that?
The Watergate scandal that brought down President Richard M. Nixon's administration, and we discussed Watergate way back in episode 7. In 1971, E. Howard Hunt had been hired by the White House Plumbers Squad. They were called the Plumbers because they were supposed to stop leaks, meaning people inside the administration who were leaking information to the press. But they did a lot of covert stuff, too. One of the things that Howard Hunt did was organize the break-ins at the Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate complex. And to do those break-ins, he used a team of former Cuban exiles. Also on the team was an American who had spent a lot of time in Cuba named Frank Sturgis. So when things went south during the second break-in on July 17, 1972, Sturgis and the Cubans were taken into custody. The trail led back to E. Howard Hunt, and they both spent time in jail for their roles in the break-ins. So both Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis will be familiar to those who've studied the Watergate scandal.
With all of that as background, we're finally ready to look at today's mystery on the CIA and the JFK assassination. So where should we begin?
Here I need to introduce a new figure into the story. His name is Willis Carto, and he was the founder of an organization called Liberty Lobby. Liberty Lobby is often described as a far-right think tank that promoted racist and anti-Semitic ideas, though Carto denied that their ideas were either racist or anti-Semitic. I'll leave listeners to make their own judgments if they want to look into those matters because, frankly, I haven't looked into those matters in any detail, and that question doesn't have anything to do with today's mystery. One thing Liberty Lobby did was publish a newspaper called The Spotlight, and on October 14, 1978, as the House Select Committee on Assassinations, or HSCA, was gearing up, The Spotlight published a piece titled CIA to Admit Hunt Involvement in Kennedy Slaying. The piece was written by a man named Victor Marchetti, and he was a former CIA agent, so you might think that he would know something about CIA workings and have sources inside the CIA. Marchetti wrote,
"A few months ago, in March, there was a meeting at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, the plush home America's super spooks overlooking the Potomac River. It was attended by several high-level clandestine officers and some former top officials of the agency. The topic of discussion was what to do about recent revelations associating President Kennedy's accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, with the spy game played between the U.S. and the USSR. A decision was made and a course of action determined. They were calculated to both fascinate and confuse the public by staging a clever, limited hangout when the House Special Committee on Assassinations holds its open hearings beginning later this month. A limited hangout is spy jargon for a favorite and frequently used gimmick of the clandestine professionals. When their veil of secrecy is shredded and they can no longer rely on a phony cover story to misinform the public, they resort to admitting, sometimes even volunteering, some of the truth while still managing to withhold the key and damaging facts in the case. The public, however, is usually so intrigued by the new information that it never thinks to pursue the matter further."
So a limited hangout is an admission of a damaging fact in hopes of concealing even more damaging facts. Marchetti went on to say that the object of this limited hangout by the CIA would be Howard Hunt.
"Chief among those to be exposed by the new investigation will be E. Howard Hunt of Watergate fame. His luck has run out, and the CIA has decided to sacrifice him to protect its clandestine services. The agency is furious with Hunt for having dragged it publicly into the Nixon mess and for having blackmailed it after he was arrested. Besides, Hunt is vulnerable, an easy target, as they say in the spy business. His reputation and integrity have been destroyed. The death of his wife, Dorothy, in a mysterious plane crash in Chicago still disturbs many people, especially since there were rumors from informed sources that she was about to leave him and perhaps even turn on him. In addition, it is well known that Hunt hated JFK and blamed him for the Bay of Pigs disaster. And now in recent months, his alibi for his whereabouts on the day of the shooting have come unstuck. In the public hearings, the CIA will admit that Hunt was involved in the conspiracy to kill Kennedy. The CIA may go so far as to admit that there were 3 gunmen shooting at Kennedy. The FBI, while publicly embracing the Warren Commission's one man acting alone conclusion, has always privately known that there were 3 gunmen. The conspiracy involved many more people than the ones who actually fired at Kennedy, both agencies may now admit.
Now, we just heard references to both the CIA and the FBI, and there's a distinction between them in terms of what they're allowed to do. By law, the CIA is only allowed to collect information on people in other countries and to conduct covert operations in other countries. It is not allowed to gather information on American citizens or conduct covert operations within the United States. By contrast, the FBI is allowed to investigate people here in America, and it's allowed to conduct sting operations here in America. And just for our friends, our former British overlords across the pond, the FBI is kind of like our version of MI5, and the CIA is our version of MI6. But there have been lots of cases where the two agencies have illegally done things that they weren't allowed to do, so keep that in mind going forward. In his article, Victor Marchetti also said that the CIA would finger Frank Sturgis and another man named Jerry Patrick Hemming as having involvement with the assassination, and that they would admit that Hunt was present in Dallas on November 22, 1963, the day of the assassination. After the article appeared, Hunt filed a lawsuit against Liberty Lobby, claiming that it had libeled him by linking him to the Kennedy assassination, and the case went to trial. In 1981, a jury in Miami found in favor of Hunt and awarded him $650,000 in damages, or $2.4 million after all the inflation the government has caused, which would have been enough to bankrupt Liberty Lobby. But in 1983, the 11th Circuit of the U.S. Court of Appeals overturned the verdict, stating that the judge had given improper instructions to the jury. A second trial thus began in 1985, and this time Willis Carto got new legal representation. The key figure was an attorney from New York named Mark Lane. Lane was a liberal civil rights attorney, and he was an expert on the Kennedy assassination. In fact, in 1966, he published a book called Rush to Judgment. In it, he conducted an extensive critique of the Warren Report. The book became a #1 bestseller, and it did a large amount of damage in the public mind to the government's claim that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone nut assassin who had killed the president by himself. This helped set the stage for the House to revisit the matter with the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s, and Lane himself testified before that committee. Just to give you a taste of what Lane was like in person, here's a clip of him appearing on the political debate program Firing Line with former CIA agent William F. Buckley. And notice in this clip how confident and in charge of the facts Lane appears compared to Buckley.
It is, I think, a matter of some importance as far as the American thinking community is concerned to investigate motives, to investigate one's general attitude towards the events in Dallas. For instance, Harrison Salisbury of the New York Times, who has himself been accused of being much too liberal.
Who accused him of that?
Me.
Oh.
Has said that Mr. Mark Lane, quotes, as a New York attorney, was made a career of insinuating that Mr. Kennedy was the victim of a right-wing plot.
Yeah, now, what I mean by unjust criticism is to take that early comment, which he wrote when he did the introduction to the Warren Report, and to ignore his present statement, where he states now, and although the New York Times will not tell you this, although he's the associate managing editor, in the recent review on The Progressive, he's indicated that he finds much substance in my charges. And in a recent Canadian broadcasting company broadcast, he said if he were asked again, he would not do the introduction to the Warren report because he doesn't have sufficient confidence in it.
Well, that I was not aware of.
In view of Lane's command of the facts regarding the Kennedy assassination, Willis Carto was well served by engaging Lane to represent him in court. And even though Lane was on the left and Carto was on the right, Lane didn't have a problem representing him and defending him.
What kind of defenses would Lane have had available to him to defend Liberty Lobby against Hunt's charge of libel? And what is libel anyway?
Libel is a form of defamation. Defamation is making false statements that damage a person's reputation. Slander is defamation that occurs in speech, which is transient, and libel is defamation that occurs in a more permanent form, like in print. Since the Spotlight was a newspaper, the Victor Marchetti argument could be libelous, and so Hunt had sued Liberty Lobby, the publisher. There are a number of defenses against libel in U.S. law, but two of them are relevant here. The first defense is truth. That is, if you can show that what you said was true, then it obviously wasn't a false statement, and thus was neither libel nor any other form of defamation. The second defense is what's known as qualified privilege. There are a number of qualities that need to be present for this, but the basic idea is that in some situations, like reported in the news, people have the privilege of reporting what they believe to be the case, even if they are mistaken in what they believe. One way of defeating qualified privilege is by showing that a news organization published a piece with actual malice. In practice, showing actual malice means showing that a false statement was published in the knowledge that it was false, or that it was published with reckless disregard for the truth, or that it was published with ill will or some other improper motive. All of those presuppose, though, that the statement was actually false. If you can show the statement was true, that's generally an absolute defense against a libel charge.
Then let's look at the 1985 trial. How did it begin?
Well, after the preliminary motions, there was the selection of the jury to be attended to. In his book, Plausible Denial, Mark Lane writes,
"Before the case began, I asked Carto what kind of jury he would like. He has surprised me by responding, 'I'd like blacks and Jews to be on the jury.' And when I asked for his thinking, he said, 'I'm tired of being called racist and anti-Semitic. I want all the facts to come out so that a jury can rule on all of it.' I suggested that those issues might be better left for another occasion, since our present trial agenda, proving that Hunt and the CIA were responsible for the assassination of President Kennedy, was sufficiently complex. Later, the question of racism and anti-Semitism became factors in a case I have previously mentioned, a case that found Liberty Lobby Incorporated and William F. Buckley, Jr. as adversaries in a defamation trial in the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. The jury for that trial, in which Liberty Lobby prevailed, was composed entirely of African-American men and women. But for our trial, when the selection process was completed, we had offered a jury comprised of blacks, Cubans, Jews, Southern whites, rich and poor, men and women. For a considerable period of time, Hunt's two lawyers carefully scrutinized the list and asked incisive questions. Finally, both sides certified that the jury was satisfactory to them. The two parties agreed that an impartial jury of intelligent and open-minded citizens had been chosen. The judge swore in the jurors, gave them preliminary instructions, and the trial began.
The two sides then made their opening statements to the jury. Hunt's lawyer, William Snyder, said that his client was a patriotic American, even if he had some flaws in his past, and that he would show that the Victor Marchetti article was false. Lane responded that the statements in the article that were presented as facts, as opposed to speculations about what the CIA might do in the future, were true, and that he would show this with witnesses. Hunt's lawyers then began calling their witnesses, and the first witness to be called was Hunt himself. Lane writes,
"The first witness to testify was E. Howard Hunt. His testimony might prove to be dispositive of all the issues in the case. If the jury believed him, then the allegations published against him were untrue. He appeared to be open and frank and righteously indignant that so grave and so false an assertion might have been published against him. I studied his demeanor. It could not be faulted. If I were a film director casting the role of an aggrieved public servant, I would have hired him on the spot. He seemed sincere, but perhaps a trifle too contentious to be likable. Snyder carefully and cleverly led Hunt through the early stages of his direct examination. The attempt was obviously to demystify the Hunt aura, to explain to the jury that this man, who had been branded as a criminal by his government, was, in fact, a decent, patriotic, and brave American who had served his nation at great personal risk. He was, in fact, a war hero, and then some. The effort seemed to me to be entirely successful. I watched the jurors as Hunt testified. They seemed impressed, even moved, by the understated fashion in which Hunt told the story of his pre-CIA years. His entry into that organization had been wonderfully and simply presented. The jury admired Hunt. I admired the classical selection and the presentation organized by Snyder. Snyder had established that Hunt was hardly a thug. He had won a scholarship, earned a membership in Phi Beta Kappa, secured a Guggenheim Fellowship, was persistent and lion-hearted, and was a published author. His employment with the CIA seemed to flow quite naturally from his patriotic commitment.
However, there was a bump when they hit one aspect of Hunt's testimony, which concerned the Bay of Pigs.
Hunt described in detail his leadership role in the Bay of Pigs operation designed to overthrow the Cuban government. When asked the outcome of the invasion, his anger, obviously directed against President Kennedy for not providing what Hunt and his colleagues considered sufficient air support, was apparent. Later, Hunt seemed unable, when asked about his initial meeting with Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, to disguise his enmity toward the man who had summarily discouraged Dulles. That man was, of course, President Kennedy. Hunt added that Dulles had been cast to the wolves, as had others in the CIA after the failure of the Bay of Pigs.
The testimony then turned to where Hunt had been on the day Kennedy had been killed, and he said that he had not been in Dallas but in Washington, D.C.
That morning, I went to my office as usual, and midday, my wife drove down from our home in suburban Maryland with our 2-month-old child, picked me up at the office, and we were going to have Chinese food that night, so we drove down to 8th Street, between 8th and 9th, where the majority of the Chinese restaurants are located, and I sat in the car with our infant son while she went into a couple of Chinese grocery stores and made purchases. This was midday, I couldn't be exact, but I was seated in the car when the first news flash came that Mr. Kennedy had been killed. And so, when my wife came back a few minutes later, I told her. As we pulled away from the curb, I heard that government employees were not to return to their office, that the government was closing down for the rest of the afternoon. So we drove out Connecticut Avenue for a ways, and then saw Walt Kuzmuk, a colleague of mine, on the way out. We veered over to Wisconsin Avenue, picked up my younger daughter Kevin, who was at the Sidwell Friends School. And it was no surprise to her because some of her classmates were children of the Robert Kennedys, and Secret Service people had come to pick them up immediately, including the Attorney General. And by the time we got to our home, out just beyond the district line, my elder daughter, who had been bussed in from Ursuline Academy, a girls' parochial school, and my son, who was about 9 or 10 then, St. John, just walked home the 2 or 3 blocks from the Brookmont Elementary School. So by 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock at the latest, the entire family was assembled in the house. Well, we stayed pinned to the television sets watching the events, the shocking redepictions of what went on-the-spot tales from reporters of what had happened, and all the speculation. And I remember at one point, there was some thought that maybe it was going to be an invasion. The Russians were coming, or right-wing kooks had done it, and so forth. But it was a very bad day for the entire nation. And, like I suppose many other families, we spent the entire weekend at our television sets until after the services on Monday, at which time the nation began to breathe again, and we with it.
Lane then comments on how people reacted to this testimony.
The jurors looked at Hunt as he told his story, anxious to determine if he was speaking truthfully. He testified firmly and without hesitation. This speech, I concluded, had been well rehearsed, an observation that contains no innuendo. Counsel was obligated to review the expected testimony with the witness before trial, and to concentrate upon the pertinent aspect of the attestation until it was molded into a form that would have the appropriate impact on the jury. As Hunt described the moment when his family could breathe freely again, Snyder heaved a not insubstantial sigh of relief. He exchanged glances with Hunt's other attorney, Dunn. The testimony had gone perfectly. I watched the scene closely, confident that we had, in all likelihood, just won the case.
So, despite how well Hunt's testimony had just gone about him being in Washington, D.C. on the day of the Kennedy assassination, Lane was convinced that they had likely just won the case.
And we'll hear more about that in a minute, but first, we'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Dustin B., Clint C., Brett, Robert S., and Joseph R. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. More than 90% of our financial support comes from individual donors like you, and you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. So, Jimmy, what did Hunt's lawyers do after they had finished getting his testimony about where he had been on the day of the assassination?
He then turned to doing some damage control because Hunt was convicted and had spent time in prison for his role in the Watergate burglaries. In particular, he had admitted that he had committed perjury or lying under oath during Watergate. So Snyder asked him about that and gave him the opportunity to explain the circumstances, with the implication being that, well, now the circumstances are different, so he was not lying now in this trial. Hunt had also demanded money from the Nixon administration after the burglars were caught, so Snyder also asked him if he'd ever been accused of blackmailing President Nixon. Hunt said that, yes, John Dean, one of the president's attorneys, had accused him of that, but he said that Dean was a young lawyer who didn't realize that Hunt was merely asking for payment of a budget item that Dean didn't know about. Lane continues.
During his appearance on the witness stand, Hunt had made it clear that he admired President Kennedy, shared common concerns with him, and would never seek to harm him physically or in any other fashion. He liked the man and felt an empathy for him. The suggestion that he would conspire to assassinate him was absurd. When the direct examination was completed, Dunn, Snyder, and Hunt shook hands. They all seemed to agree that the plaintiff had been a formidable witness who had favorably impressed the jury. Lee and Whitmore, the other two members of my team, shared that belief. We all agreed that the only obvious flaw in his testimony was the expression of anger regarding the treatment of his CIA colleagues by President Kennedy. It raised questions about the extent and genuineness of his stated admiration for the late president.
Now it was Lane's turn to cross-examine Hunt, and one of the things he turned to was the question of whether Hunt had, in fact, blackmailed President Nixon.
I knew that Hunt had made a demand for funds from the Nixon Committee to re-elect the president, referred to in the media as CREEP. I asked him if he had spoken with any member of that organization. He responded that he had met with
Mr. O'Brien, who was a member of the committee to re-elect the president. He was assistant counsel for it.
I asked Hunt if he had demanded that O'Brien provide substantial sums for him. He responded,
Yes, I did.
He said he could not recall how much money he had ordered CREEP to pay him on that occasion. I asked Hunt if, in essence, he had told the CREEP attorney that,
I want that money. If I don't get it, I will reveal certain seamy things.
He admitted that he had made that statement. He had also admitted that when he testified before a federal grand jury about that confrontation with O'Brien, he had committed perjury by denying that it had taken place. The evidence revealed that Hunt had directed Nixon's committee to pay him $50,000 and then $60,000 and then $72,000. If the White House did not provide the demanded funds, Hunt had threatened to expose their illegal conspiracies in other, more serious affairs. I showed Hunt a document he had written while he was attempting to extort money from the White House. I asked him about it. Question. Do you recall having written at any time documents which contain the statement, "The Watergate bugging is only one of a number of highly illegal conspiracies engaged in by one or more of the defendants at the behest of senior White House officials. These as yet undisclosed crimes can be proved"? Do you recall ever writing that?
I have a recollection of it. I think it was a reminder I sent to Mr. Charles Colson, possibly.
When did you send that to Mr. Colson, if you recall?
After the death of my wife, probably before I entered prison.
Was that in reference to a request by you for sums of money?
Yes, definitely.
Were you saying to the White House that you had information about highly illegal conspiracies engaged in by one or more of the Watergate defendants at the behest of senior White House officials, and these undisclosed crimes could be proved, and they better pay you the money you asked?
And they were proved.
Is that what you were saying? These could be proved? You had the information, they were undisclosed, and they had better give you the money?
They had better keep their promise. That's right. My last gasp trying to keep my family intact before I went to prison.
Is that blackmail?
No.
Hunt denied that he had ever engaged in blackmail. Since what he had done had been established beyond cavil, the only remaining question appeared to be the definition of the relevant term. Question. What is blackmail?
Blackmail is extortion, as I understand it, which is trying illegally to obtain that which is not your due. That is the operative word. All these sums described had been promised at the outset of Watergate, and the principles had fallen by the wayside. And we were the ones who were left exposed and in prison.
Are you an attorney?
No, I am not.
Would you accept that it is the rule of law in this country that extortion, which you are quite correct, is the technical and correct term for blackmail, is an effort to secure something which, whether it is due to you or not, you try to secure through extra-legal methods?
I never heard that definition of it until now.
Have you ever read any law book where the crime extortion is defined?
I looked it up in the Webster Dictionary, in the large one, yes.
How about Black's Law Dictionary?
No, I don't have access. Webster's.
There was then a court recess, and after the recess, Mark Lane continued.
During the recess, I went to the library on the second floor of this building, and I got from it Webster's Third International Dictionary, unabridged, which has 2,662 pages. Perhaps that is the one you were referring to. I have copied page 806, which has the definition of extortion. I think you said you read it in here. It is Defendant's Exhibit 8 for the identification. I ask you if you can read that and see if that is what you read in the big Webster's Dictionary. Pause. Have you finished reading that definition of the word extortion, to extort?
Extort is what I am starting to read.
Tell me when you finish reading.
I shall. Lengthy pause. I am with you.
Is that what you read?
Can't have been this, because the distinctive phrase I recall was something which is not once due you. That does not appear here.
It does not appear?
It does not appear here, no.
So Hunt had to admit that a standard dictionary definition of extortion did not contain the escape clause that would let him deny that what he had done was extortion. Of course, what it says in Webster's Dictionary is not what controls the definition of extortion under U.S. law. That would be the United States Code, and the U.S. Code also did not contain Hunt's escape clause. Under the law, he had committed extortion or blackmail. Lane continues.
By any authoritative standard, Hunt had repeatedly committed the crime of extortion. He was not prosecuted for those crimes. No doubt due to the reluctance of federal authorities who feared that the highly illegal conspiracies engineered by the administration to which Hunt had continually made reference would be exposed. What was perplexing to me was why counsel for Hunt would allege that their client, so notorious a blackmailer, was offended and defamed when a publication observed that he had engaged in extortion. I asked Hunt to tell us about the conspiracies that were so serious that he had expected the White House to provide, in the final analysis, hundreds of thousands of dollars to purchase his silence. He replied,
Now, I am not sure what I had in mind at the time. I was on the verge of going to prison, and my thinking was very, very disturbed at that point.
The jurors stared at Hunt. Hunt had based his entire post-Watergate behavior upon the fact that he had the proof about the highly illegal conspiracies that had been initiated by the White House. On innumerable occasions, he confronted Nixon. Through his counsel, Charles Colson, or through officials of his re-election committee, Creep, to make more funds available to him or risk the consequence of disclosure. Hunt had made it perfectly clear that he had squirreled away the evidence that he was in position to deal a serious, perhaps fatal, blow to the administration. After Nixon was reelected, he refused to submit any longer to Hunt's extortion. He called Hunt's bluff, and Hunt flinched. No doubt after considering the not inconsiderable risk to himself inherent in publicly confessing that in addition to being guilty of the crimes with which he had already been charged, he was also a self-confessed blackmailer at the highest level. Hunt discovered what his colleagues among professional extortionists had long known. It's difficult business replete with uncertainties. It has much in common with kidnapping, another hazardous occupation. Unlike bank robbery or insider trading, crimes that may be committed in one fell swoop, kidnapping requires a second stage of criminal exposure. The criminal has to seek to ransom the fruit of his first crime. Likewise, the blackmailer, who may have obtained his evidence through illegal means, must expose himself each time he requests payment. It is for that reason that the quality criminal shuns extortion and kidnapping as too chancy. Perhaps the jurors could understand why Hunt had exercised discretion and had not sought to bring down the administration in a Samson-like act of revenge. After all, it hadn't worked out too well for Samson. Yet they could hardly believe that Hunt just did not remember the cataclysmic events he had in mind, while he was so persistently making demands in the White House, in person and in writing. Hunt looked away and shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair. I sensed that a sea change had occurred. The jurors, I believed, had decided that Hunt was telling monumental untruths.
And that was the purpose of this line of questioning, to establish that Hunt was willing to lie under oath, not just in a past situation, but here and now. That would lay the groundwork for impeaching Hunt's testimony about where he was on the day of the Kennedy assassination. But first, Lane wanted to show the kinds of lengths that Hunt was willing to go to against American citizens that he had a beef with. And so he focused on Daniel Ellsberg and his attorney, Leonard Boudin. Dr. Daniel Ellsberg had been a U.S. military analyst during the Vietnam War, and in 1971, Ellsberg leaked a classified history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam known as the Pentagon Papers, which revealed that multiple administrations, from Truman to Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson, had lied both to the American public and the U.S. Congress about Vietnam. Well, that's the kind of leak that the White House Plumbers Squad wasn't down with. So they had set out on a campaign to destroy Ellsberg's reputation in the press.
Do you think that is right?
Do I think what is right?
To try to destroy a person's reputation utilizing the armed forces of the United States government in its secret operations, to destroy the credibility of an American citizen. Do you think that is right?
If he were the individual that we believed him to be at that time, absolutely.
If he was a traitor, he should have been tried for treason. Is that correct?
That's correct.
He then could have defended himself against the charge in court. Is that correct?
That's correct. That is the way our judicial system works. We like to think so.
But he was not given that opportunity, was he, Mr. Hunt? Because you were mounting a covert operation to secretly destroy his reputation and his credibility. Is that correct?
It had begun, yes.
Is that right? Do you support that activity?
Do I support that activity?
Yes.
I wish I never heard of Watergate. I wish I never had been employed in the White House.
It did not work out too well for you. That is not what I'm asking. Do you support the use of secret weapons by the U.S. government to destroy the credibility of American citizens?
I would have to say it depends upon who those American citizens are.
If they're criminals, should they not be prosecuted for their crimes? But should people be hiding in dark shadows to destroy their reputations in such a fashion that they cannot defend themselves?
You're asking me for a legal conclusion.
I am asking you what you believe. Do you believe that is proper?
If what is proper?
To try to destroy the credibility and reputation of American citizens in a secret fashion.
Under the circumstances then obtaining, I had no problem with it at the time. Today, I obviously would.
Why? What is different?
A lot is different.
What is different?
I have matured a good deal since then. I have seen how insubstantial Mr. Colson's frame of reference was.
Have you sent a letter of apology to Dr. Ellsberg?
No.
Lane then got Hunt to admit that he had proposed an illegal operation of the type that the CIA refers to as a black bag job to burgle the offices of Ellsberg's psychiatrist and get files that could be used to harm Ellsberg's reputation in the press. Lane also got him to admit that he had undertaken a similar character assassination project against Ellsberg's lawyer, Leonard Boudin, and that Hunt himself had written an article against Boudin that was then published under the name of a journalist with the journalist's complicity.
Do you think that is right?
Do I think what is right? That was the purpose of the operation.
I know that was the purpose. Do you think it is proper for public funds to be used in a surreptitious fashion to write an article in a newspaper so that when the American people read the newspaper, they think it was written by a journalist, not by someone being paid by the White House?
I thought so, that it was proper under the circumstances prevailing at the time. I no longer think so.
Hunt had taken all available positions on the question. He had justified his actions. He had denied doing what he had done. And finally, when the evidence was undeniable, he asserted that he had reformed. Moments before the Reformation, however, he had made disparaging and irrelevant remarks about Leonard Boudin's family. The jurors watched. They knew that the plaintiff, in spite of his protestation, had been engaged in criminal conduct and had utilized deception within the United States for the purpose of destroying the reputation of American citizens. But would he have acted similarly if the assigned target had been President Kennedy? Absolutely not, he had proclaimed. He liked John Kennedy. I asked him what his attitude had been about the late president.
Well, he was a young man of my generation. I had met him socially in Boston, thought well of him. I served in the South Pacific the same time he did. We were both naval officers. At one time, I felt a great deal of empathy for him.
Were you ever involved in any kind of disinformation to embarrass him?
President Kennedy?
Yes.
No.
The problem with Hunt's response, although it was presented without hesitation and with apparent sincerity and feeling, was that it was entirely untruthful. I continued. Did you ever have discussions with Mr. Colson about forging some cables in order to blame John F. Kennedy for the death of the leader of South Vietnam? Hunt paused. He looked at his attorneys for help. There was nothing they could do. The question was proper. Finally, Hunt spoke, slowly and quietly.
Yes, that is a matter of public record. I can't remember whether Kennedy himself was to be blamed, but certainly the Nixon administration, the Kennedy administration, by the Nixon administration.
Did you ever have discussions with Mr. Colson in which you agreed to falsify State Department cables to show that President John F. Kennedy's administration ordered the assassination of South Vietnamese President Diem?
I did.
And in fact, did you falsify and forge those cables?
Did I? Lengthy pause. Yes, I did.
I then asked Hunt to explain how he had forged the documents in order to charge John F. Kennedy, after his death, with a murder for which he was not responsible.
Lane then got Hunt to explain how he had forged cables so that they would fit in with the authentic diplomatic cables from July of 1963, and that made it look like President Kennedy was responsible for the assassination of the Vietnamese president and Kennedy's fellow Catholic, Ngo Dinh Diem.
Hunt, after swearing that he had never been involved in a disinformation effort to embarrass Kennedy, had now testified that he had merely sought to doctor and create evidence to prove that Kennedy was a murderer. Hunt offered a rationale for his aberrant behavior that I found no less astonishing than the fact that he had fabricated the evidence. Question. In essence, then, you forged documents in order to make it seem that John F. Kennedy and his administration were involved in assassinating the head of state. Is that correct?
Which I believed to be the case.
And so you forged evidence to show that your theory about the matter was accurate? Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Was that proper?
No, it was not proper.
We had learned a great deal about Hunt in the hours of cross-examination. I think we had demonstrated to the jury that he disliked John Kennedy. He had used deception to frame him after his death, was willing to violate the law to complete his assignments, had no respect for the basic institutions of this nation or any other nation, found the judicial system to be an inadequate method for settling disputes, had regularly and persistently committed perjury, and favored, as he testified, the murder of a head of state who pursued a foreign and domestic policy that contrasted with the CIA's worldview. Hunt had testified that he certainly hoped the CIA was attempting to kill Castro, and had no objection based on morality to the assassination of the leaders of the Soviet Union. Kennedy had betrayed Hunt's operation to destroy the Cuban Revolution and assassinate Castro. He was also about to wind down the CIA's adventure in Vietnam. The jurors believed, I think for the first time, that Hunt and his colleagues in the CIA may have had the motive, inclination, and ability to kill the president. That certainly was far short of proof they had done so. The next step was establishing opportunity.
So now it was time to connect Hunt directly to the Kennedy assassination, and that meant looking at his alibi for the day of the event. Now, Hunt had actually told several different versions of his alibi over the years, including under oath, but the details kept changing because the details kept being proved wrong, like who had seen him in Washington on November 22nd. In this trial, he named 2 CIA employees, both of whom he had just remembered had seen him that day. One was a woman named Connie Mazarov, and the other was a man named Walter Kuzmuk. As the cross-examination proceeded, Lane showed problems with Hunt's alibi, but we're going to skip most of that and go straight to the heart of the matter. The only thing I'll mention is that Lane got Hunt to admit that CIA records showed that Hunt had taken 11 hours of sick leave in the pay period ending the day after the Kennedy assassination, so he was out of the office for more than a day and a half, though the records did not show which days he was out of the office. Now, you'll recall that in his testimony at this trial, Hunt had said that he was in Washington, D.C. on the day of the assassination, that he and his wife had gone shopping for the ingredients for a Chinese dinner that they were going to make at their home. And then after news of the assassination broke, they spent the next 3 days with their children glued to the television set like everyone else watching the coverage of the assassination. You'll also recall that after hearing this testimony, Lane had been convinced that they had likely just won the case. Here's why.
I now set out to close the trap I had set many months before when I had taken Hunt's deposition. On that occasion, Hunt had described in great detail how his entire family had huddled together in his Maryland home from Friday, November 22nd, 1963, until either Monday or Tuesday of the next week. He could not recall leaving the home for 48 or possibly 72 hours. There would have been no particular reason to, he testified. Hunt, his wife, and his children, like thousands of other Americans, millions, remained together. They all stayed there and watched via television the burial services. At this trial, he acknowledged the accuracy of that deposition transcript and asserted that his statements were truthful. I then asked him about the testimony he had offered at the first trial of the Liberty Lobby case on December 16, 1981. Question: do you recall testifying back on December 16, 1981, that when the allegation was made that you were in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963, your children were really upset? Do you recall testifying to that?
Yes.
Do you recall testifying that you had to reassure them that you were not in Texas that day?
Yes.
That you had nothing to do with the Kennedy assassination?
That's right.
And that you were being persecuted for reasons that were unknown to you?
Yes.
Did you say that the allegation that you were in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963 was the focus of a great deal of interfamily friction and tended to exacerbate difficulties in the family?
I did.
Although neither Hunt nor his attorneys seemed to sense what danger was about to befall them, it appeared that the jurors were anticipating the next question, confident that they knew what it would be. I put down the dog-eared 1981 trial transcript. I looked at Hunt and softly asked the most difficult question he was going to face at this trial. Mr. Hunt, why did you have to convince your children that you were not in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963? If, in fact, as you say, a 14-year-old daughter, a 13-year-old daughter, and a 10-year-old son were with you in the Washington, D.C. area on November 22nd, 1963, and were with you at least for the next 48 hours, as you all stayed glued to the TV set. If someone had struck Hunt in the face, his reaction would not have been more physical. His head jerked back. He stared at his attorneys. Snyder and Dunn, apparently thunderstruck, began to speak to each other in whispers. The delay before Hunt responded seemed interminable. In absolute time, it probably was not more than half a minute. Finally, Hunt spoke, looking away from the jurors.
May I reply?
I answered, "Please, it is a question." He spoke quickly, as if he hoped the subject would soon be forgotten.
These were unformed minds, and I felt that it was absolutely imperative that I remind them of the circumstances attendant upon our family that day. Yet my other son, Howard St. John, had read in the Berkeley Barb and in other papers these constant reiterations of my involvement in the Kennedy assassination. So it was less a question of my convincing them that I was in Washington, D.C. with them, rather reminding them that I was, than it was to assure them that none of the charges and allegations that had been made, particularly those of the tramp in Dealey Plaza, had any substance to them at all.
How could they believe, Mr. Hunt, that the tramp photographs, as they have been called, which purport to show you in Dealey Plaza, Dallas, Texas, on November 22nd, 1963, could be authentic when they were with you at that time in the Washington, D.C. area and were with you for 48 hours in front of a TV set?
Because of the constant reiteration of the charges, the appearance of people like comedian Dick Gregory at news conferences, Dick Gregory call-in radio shows, the prevalence of the theories that Hunt or the CIA somehow had something to do with it. Of course, they were well aware that I worked for the CIA. My name was linked with it, and usually linked in connection with the Kennedy assassination. It was a very difficult problem that I had with my children.
One can see where they might be disturbed that you were being charged with this. But weren't they of the opinion that there were 3 people who could prove to the whole world that these charges were a tissue of lies? That I was with my father during that whole time period? What I want to know is, since they knew how outrageous the lies were, why did they have to be convinced by you that you weren't in Texas?
Reminded.
They didn't remember that themselves? Hunt paused again. He wiped his forehead with a handkerchief.
The constant reiteration of these charges, in one form or another, had an extremely deleterious effect on my children. I conferred with them. I answered their questions. I gave them every assurance that I was never in Dealey Plaza at any time in my life, not only on the fatal day, but on the day before, the day after. In short, never. That was the type of assurance I was forced to give to my family.
Were all of these children with you on the day after the assassination of President Kennedy? The witness reached for a glass of water and drank it slowly. Then he spoke.
They were, as during the day of the assassination. That is correct.
You testified, Mr. Hunt, that your adult children came to you after it was alleged that you were in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963, and said to you, "Is there any truth to this?" Have you testified that was what they said?
I have. That is correct.
Hunt's explanation only exacerbated the matter. If the 3 children had been exposed to the false allegations over a period of time, does it not seem likely that they would remember somewhere along the lines where they had spent one of the most traumatic moments of their lives and who had been with them? Why had they not shouted out that their father was innocent? Failing that, how could they require constant reminders from their father that they had all been together that day? The record revealed that as each new allegation was made, asserting that E. Howard Hunt had been in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, the children, then adults, demanded to know if the charges were true. Rarely does a witness testify that he had to remind his alibi witnesses where they were at the crucial moment. In this case, the time frame was considerably prolonged and the event nationally significant, thereby substantially diminishing the possibility that it could have been so easily forgotten. These 3 witnesses were to offer the essential testimony, placing Hunt hundreds of miles from the crime. They, not the 2 CIA arranged witnesses, held in their hands the alibi their father so desperately required. Hunt had told so many stories and given so many different versions of his actions and whereabouts on November 22nd, 1963, that he had apparently failed to realize that 2 sets of stories, that he had been with his children the whole time, and that his children did not know where he had been at that time, were mutually exclusive explanations.
So, wham! If Hunt's alibi were true, his children would have known that their father was with them in Washington, D.C., or the Washington, D.C. area on the day of the assassination, eating a Chinese meal and watching the TV coverage of the event. They would not have needed him to tell them later where he was on the day in question. His alibi thus completely fell apart. Mark Lane had thus completely destroyed Howard Hunt's credibility as a witness in the lawsuit that he had brought. But Lane hadn't won his case yet. Just because he's shown that Hunt was lying about being at home on the day of the assassination, that didn't prove that he was in Dallas or that he was connected with the Kennedy killing. So you'll want to tune in next week to hear all about that.
Until then, Jimmy, what further resources can we offer to the listeners and viewers on the subject?
We'll have links to Mark Lane's book, Plausible Denial, also Marita Lorenz's book, Marita, The Spy Who Loved Castro, St. John Hunt's book, Bond of Secrecy, Woodward and Bernstein's book, All the President's Men, also a link to the full interview that Lane did with William F. Buckley on Firing Line, and the New York Times article, which contains the famous quote about Kennedy wanting to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces.
All right. And now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about E. Howard Hunt and the JFK assassination? You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @mys_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for their video and animation work on this episode. Check it out by going to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And while you're there, you can help me out by liking, commenting, writing a review, sharing the podcast with others, and especially by subscribing. We recently passed 100,000 subscribers finally, and we're working our way towards 200,000. So you can help us get there by subscribing and hitting the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video.
I'd also like to thank Patrick Mason, Robert King, and Father Andrew Kinstetter for their voiceover work on this episode. So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week, we're going to be going back to 1985 and the Howard Hunt versus Liberty Lobby trial, and we're going to be hearing from other witnesses, including a woman named Marita Lorenz, a former lover of Fidel Castro, who will be given some very startling testimony.
All right. Folks, be sure to check out the Mysterious World bookstore at mysteriousworldstore.com for links to all the books and videos that Jimmy mentions in the show. Get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You can find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion today on our show notes at mysterious.fm/391. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Tom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.